This is Right Now with the New Republic's twice weekly video cast, what I think we're calling it. I'm honored to be joined this morning by Meredith Shiner and Anna Marie Cox. They're both great journalists. I think of us, the three of us, as kind of one-time Washington insiders who are, who I'm not an insider. I'm definitely not in Washington because I'm in Louisville now. Meredith is in Chicago. Anna is in, where are you in Texas?
I'm in Austin.
You're in Austin. Okay, a
Yeah.
great town in Texas. So
I love the long windup to just say people with souls.
people.
Oh
My friends in DC have souls, or some of them. They all have souls. Some people in DC don't have souls. We'll come back to that later.
I can't believe I undercut my own essay that we're going to be talking about precisely later in the show. But
So let me start with I want to make clear I condemn political violence. What happened with Charlie Kirk
Sorry,
is
that's
terrible.
not funny, but to have to start out with
yes,
is
sure.
very of our time.
But nothing should be an executable offense in this country.
But
not a traffic stop, not a horrible campus speech.
I agree.
Yeah.
What I want to ask is about, I think for our audience is important. I got 27 emails and lots of text messages about, can you believe that Ezra Klein column? So I want to start there, which is like Ezra Klein, New York Times columnist, liberal columnist, wrote a piece basically saying Charlie Kirk practiced politics the way it should be practiced, sort of extolling him as someone who was interested in persuasion and debate and so on. And this is not a piece where just the headline was misleading. That was the article too. And so I want to talk about that first. I want to talk about, let's start with what did you all think of the column itself?
I'll go first.
Go ahead. Yes.
Because I wrote the kind of response
to it, right?
Unknowingly wrote a response column, which means he and I probably both wrote overnight.
Yes.
Right. Mm-hmm. So people should know that the headline, a lot of times people are not served well by their headlines, but if you saw the headline of this piece, you saw a quote from the piece.
Yeah.
So it was an argument, and you said it right. Charlie Kirk practiced politics the right way. There is some interesting stuff in that piece. We could do a whole psychoanalysis of it because one of the things Ezra, who I don't know, I know Ezra, you all probably do too. Yes. Nice guy. He was like a young baby child when I first came to DC. It's weird to see him turn at age into an elder statesman. He said he was jealous of what Charlie built. And that he was engaged in this persuasion, right? And I think that tells us a lot of what Ezra himself and what the chattering class in DC thinks of as their highest calling, right? Which is itself debate? ? Mm-hmm. Is that really what your highest calling is? I think one thing that might distinguish us as people who are writing for a place like New Republic is my highest calling is not persuasion. I am not interested in persuading people necessarily. I am interested in good policy. I am interested in saving people's lives. I am interested in forwarding arguments, but I want to help create arguments that create movement. I am not interested in persuasion for persuasion's sake.
Well, I think the argument might be that persuasion leads to policy change. That's what the argument I'm sure he would give.
Only if we meditate on the question of to what end.
And that's the problem. I'll let you go in a second. Yeah. But that's the problem with the piece. Is he doesn't say that. He only values persuasion. That whole piece is isn't persuasion great? Isn't it great to persuade with no and anyway, I'm gonna go take care of my dog, and that'll give Meredith some time.
Yeah,
his name is Exley. Hi, Exley.
I want to build on that because I think that there are sort of two main points that I wanted to hit at. One of the weird grading pieces of the discourse that I've seen in the past few weeks generally is this idea that blue sky is a bubble. But I do really worry about all of these mainstream reporters who are still on Twitter or X or whatever we want to call it because of how co-opted it's become by the right wing. And if you look at, there was recent polling that polled young people on whether they even knew who Charlie Kirk was. And 50% of young people had never heard of him. Another share said, they didn't know enough to have an opinion. So the people for whom Charlie Kirk really mattered, they mattered, but they were certainly a minority in terms of the actual public. But the only way you could think that Charlie Kirk was this huge national figure of supreme consequence is if you lived on Twitter. And I think that a lot of the mainstream reporters, television producers, assignment editors do. And I think that their perception of what his impact was really shaped by that. And I think to this idea of persuasion, um, people like Ezra, and I think that this goes back to really when he first arrived at Washington and the rise of sort of those centrist left-wing bloggers in 2008. I think that they wanted to create sort of this alternative to the blue jacket, khaki pants, Georgetown bubble of Washington, that they wanted to be seen as these smart debaters or these people who, within their sphere of influence, could like change the way that people talked in Washington or thought about Washington, particularly on the left. And I think that really aligned with where the Democratic Party was talking, particularly in 2008 and with the rise of Barack Obama. And now sort of these like centrist conversations that are really focused on tactics versus policy, like it's really this idea of persuasion to nowhere or persuading the people who talk about things versus the people who do things. And persuading the people who talk about things versus creating a deeper understanding of this moment, the policies, the changes that we need that will actually impact the public. They feel like their audience is more insular than that. You know, for someone who writes in the New York Times op-ed pages, like traditionally there was like this feeling that that was a huge platform, and when you drove conversation there, it would really shape broader conversation. But I think that the reach of that sort of platform has limited in some way. And so when you hear this, like, I'm envious of what he built, like, Charlie Kirk was able to build a particular machine to his own sort of ends and goals, which often were bigotry, hatred, or just like straight out trolling. And that's sort of how he, quote unquote, persuaded this part of the movement. And that aligned with the rise of Donald Trump in a way that, like, you know, aligning in 2008 in the blogosphere with Barack Obama had just like a different impact. And so there was no exploration of proportionality. There was no exploration of impact. And frankly, like, it's a really privileged position to be like, I'm envious that he could influence people when there are people in this country who are gay or trans or Black or Hispanic or name any number of marginalized identities who felt threatened by Charlie Kirk's existence because all he did was exist to sort of promote this hate. And that shouldn't be controversial to say. Like, the last point I want to make is thinking about how you started this conversation, Perry. I feel like it was a historian on Blue Sky, maybe Kevin Cruz, who said we should never celebrate a death, but we also shouldn't whitewash a life. And people feel a lot of fear and anxiety right now because this country is a tinderbox and it didn't happen that way out of the ether. There are actors who created this environment. And that's sort of like why we're here today. And that's why some of this coverage, whether it's this column or the mainstream television coverage or Josh Shapiro deciding to like fly the flags at half mast in Pennsylvania, feels so discordant to how normal people feel right now.
I want to ask. Let me zone in on one thing about the Ezra Klein because on Sunday Ezra Klein actually wrote a piece calling for the Democrats to get more aggressive in the shutdown, and people praised him for that. But I want to ask, just to be blunt about this, if I was asked who is the most insightful New York Times columnist, I might use names like Tressie, Lydia, or Jamel.
Right.
If I was asked who is the most conservative New York Times columnist, I would say Ross Juthat, Brett Stevens. If I was going to be asked who's the most conservative center-left columnist, I might say Maureen Dowd. So help me understand, because I think this gets to I invited you all initially on to talk about the Democratic Party. And my sense is that Ezra Klein columns are obsessed about in a way that those other people are not, because he's seen as the kind of pundit representing the almost the Democratic leadership. Like, we think he's sort of projecting Hakeem Jeffries' views, and we can yell at him in a way we can't. Why, in other words, why is Ezra Klein important, and why is his columns dissected in a way that, as I named 5 New York Times columnists who I think could be dissected in the same way, but I would argue are not.
I hope you're wrong. I just want to start out of the gate. I hope you're wrong that
Which way? You're wrong
Ezra
about what?
that Ezra is not read by like Hakeem Jeffries.
No, I'm saying
and
he is
like
read by Hakeem Jeffries. That's my point. But
no, I
we.
said I hope that he's not leading the conversation that way. But
Oh,
if he is, then that makes a lot of sense about what the Democrats are doing, right? And also, in some ways, like I wish that that's not how media was working, because I would like policy leaders to be the ones to come up with like to be crusading with the ideas, and then our job as journalists or columnists, I mean, we want to push ideas too, but ours is to like kind of figure out what's happening and tell people what's happening, right? Like I and describe it and say what the truth is. And I don't know, like I do think that that is the model that Ezra is pursuing, is like, I'm going to create the very specific policy prescriptions, and what I'd really like to do is fold them up in a letter and slip them under someone's door and have them happen, right? But the authors that you described, who I also really like, or the ones on the left, I should say, although I have a weird fondness for Roth Duthat, which I can't really explain. I think he's a lovely writer and just kind of like a nerdy guy who went wrong somewhere. But what I love about them is that they have a passion for something and are interested in the policies around it, but they have a thing they believe in, right? A policy outcome that they would like to see because it serves a higher ideal.
surely Ezra believes in abundance. I don't.
Well, but what does that
least,
even mean? But see, that's actually a wonderful example, because can we even say what abundance means? And I also don't want to finish this conversation until I can talk about my piece specifically, which we kind of started with,
Sure.
but I wound up not talking about. But we can come back to that.
Yes.
I'm just going to say something really briefly, is that I just think this column was bad.
Yeah.
I think that that's why a lot of people were talking about it. Like, there was a critical conversation because it was just completely wrong. And you presented this as like an ideological sorting, but I would also just posit that this is about skill and how the writers that you cited as good actually approach their jobs. Like, the thing that makes Jamel Bowie good isn't just that I ideologically agree with him. It's that he brings historical context. He brings research. He isn't just sort of flinging a spaghetti opinion to the wall and seeing if it sticks. When I think about writing a piece, I bring my experience of covering Congress and politics for 10 years. Like, I don't think that I could write good opinion pieces if I didn't have the experience of having been a reporter, at least for me, in terms of how I blend skill and ideology and positions. And so, for me, I always find value in people who have spent time as a reporter. Like, it's why I respect the opinions and the writing and the people on this call, or, when you think about sort of the juice box game of 2008, I really like Brian Beutler because I saw him every day on the Hill, and I know that he spent time doing some of that reporting. So it shapes the way that he writes and that he thinks. And so when you think about the reporters that you mentioned, the political positions of them, I think contribute less to how compelling or uncompelling they are versus their actual approach to thinking and to writing, and when they were actually last in a position of reporting, or how they think about formulating opinions.
I agree so much. And that's why when I come back to like what I want out of columnists and why I do what I do, and again, like when you point out the left, I think we're all talking about Jamel Tressie.
I said Lydia Palgreen, who I think is less appreciated. I think does a really good job, actually.
Lydia,
But
and
anyway,
also I would say Elizabeth Spires. I don't know if she's officially on
yes,
there, but
yeah.
one of the reasons why I love them so much is also they're very skilled writers. All of them have lives that they've led. Jamel was also obviously a on this trail reporter for a long time, and they bring the fullness of their experience to their writing. And with Ezra, I feel like, and I wonder if you would take it as a compliment, he's a kind of brain in a box, right? A brain in a jar. Like, he's just like absorbing policy, right? And then like transmitting ideas. And that's great. I love ideas. But it's funny, his most compelling writing that I've ever read is about his being a vegan. I don't know if y'all have ever read that stuff, but like,
No.
it's really fast. It's like it's a position he comes from moral territory. He's researched the lives of animals. Like, he believes in like the pain and suffering of animals being a problem, an existential problem for people. And I talked to him about that on my show, like, years ago. He wanted to talk about his book, and I was like, "No, I want," 'cause it was in his book, but, like, that's something that he's lived and can bring, like, something to. Whereas, like, it's weird to read a column where his lived experience that comes through the lines of that column is that he's jealous of Charlie Kirk.
You mentioned your piece, and I'm glad you said that because I like to have people talk about their work. But in some ways, what I was trying to bridge was your piece was was a little bit more about Democratic politicians. But I guess I was trying to say that like Josh Shapiro, Gavin
Oh, yeah.
Newsom, Ezra Klein are all kind of doing the same thing
Yes.
that you're critiquing, which is like I'm going to describe it in ideological terms. You all don't have to agree, but I do think there's a center left white man thing that is happening that is like that is, and and that's what I thought you were critiquing. So talk about your piece. That's how I read it, as a center left white man thing that you when a famous conservative who says tons of racist and bigoted things dies, he's in the club in a certain way, and I'm sort of trying to reject the club, and I think yours what you were doing too.
Oh, yes, certainly, certainly. It's funny, we all kind of went down different paths with your lead, but that's the
Yeah.
beauty of conversation, right? Um, yeah, my piece was about how I think the headline was "The Empathy Trap." And
Right.
there is definitely an ideological project that happens there, because who does the eulogizing in a situation like this? You are not seeing a ton of center left women even, like,
That's
coming out
interesting. Yeah.
and being like,
Praising him. Right. Or
Great.
yeah.
Oh, what Charlie Kirk, I didn't agree with him, but what you do get some like Kamala Harris coming out and saying, political violence has no place.
That's a different
Right.
statement, right.
It's a
Yes.
different statement, and it's not like it's not valorizing him in any way. It's simply a statement about what happened. I do want to pause here and say that the leap to calling this political violence is in and of itself kind of something we need to take a beat on,
Okay.
because we don't know what
Oh,
his
right. We
motivations
don't
is.
actually know.
We don't actually know. Like, you could say it's political violence because he was targeted as a public person, and that is one way to look at it. I'm not saying it wasn't political violence, but I think in every conversation about this,
Yes.
we need to pause and note, like, we have no idea why this happened. We do not know what the ideology of the shooter was, and if there was an ideological motive at all. Like, I think the person that shot Trump, when we look at what his case was, it does seem a lot like ideologically confused, to say the least, and also
Right.
more like in the vein of John Hinckley than
Hmm.
like an assassin. Like, he wanted the attention, right? And then the empathy trap, to get back to that specifically, is that when Democrats have performed empathy towards people who have suffered, people on the right who have had some kind of violence happen to them, especially in political context. Trump is another example. That has gotten us nothing. There is no reaching across the aisle, even in tragedy, that has led to the kind of changes that might help prevent further tragedies down the line, right? And the examples I used had to do, like, the really good examples are gun violence. There's been no amount of children dying. Like, I'm gonna get teary. Like, I mean, I was living here when Uvalde happened, and, like, a good friend of mine, my neighbor, her son was, like, in school, like, when Uvalde happened, and the terror that she felt, I was with her, right? And it's phone calls that came out of Uvalde. Those phone calls were played for conservative lawmakers, literally fell on deaf ears. We could not use empathy and sympathy to make a goddamn difference. And Charlie Kirk is one of those people that heard those calls and did nothing. And so I think that we need to think about that every time we try to hold hands in grief, every time we try to share grief with those people. Doesn't help. It doesn't help. And I think there's a level of coldness that is appropriate here.
So
The thing
there's a
I said about
human
Charlie King
reaction.
was like,
Yeah.
Charlie, very sorry for his family.
Sure.
I hope his message dies with him.
Hope his message dies with him. Meredith, you say anything?
There's so many things that I want to say to respond to that. I feel like there's a human response, and I want to end with that because I think it's the most important one. And then there is this political response. And I think the degree to which this is political violence without knowing the motivation is that we live in politically violent times. And there are so many contributors to that. We are living in a time where our democracy is weakened. And how we conceive of political violence, how we conceive of state violence. Every time a child dies in a school like Uvalde, like to me, it is critical that we understand that they are dying of government failure. They're not dying because people broadly, members of the public, think that they should die. One of the things about Uvalde that really struck me was that there was a University of Texas Austin poll. I think it was done in, I can't remember which public media outlet did it in concert with them, but the Uvalde shooting didn't change Texans' views on expanded background checks because it was already at 75%.
Oh, right. You can't move. Yes, right.
And so those children are dying of government failure. Every time a Black person dies at a traffic stop because they're murdered by the police, that is political violence because they're dying of government failure. And so our conception of how much this country is on the brink right now, how fearful people feel, like the people who are being taken into custody when they're showing up to immigration hearings, all of that is very deeply politically violent. And I think the thing that has been so discouraging about the coverage this week is that it contains no context. I mean, I'm sure that when you all saw the headlines about this shooting, like me, you felt deep and profound fear.
Mhm.
And it is because obviously it's like sad if someone dies, but also it's because the ramifications of that, the understanding of what the response would be. The mainstream media coverage hasn't really focused in on what the president said in response to this idea that we should be going after any Democrat who called any of these actions hateful or authoritarian. Like that is a feature of authoritarianism. That isn't a bug, that is a feature. And so that's the thing that makes this time so scary. And then on the human front, one of the things that I was thinking about as you were talking is just, and what I've been thinking about this week as I've been reading these hagiographies, is that I actually think it's more work to be a good person. It is so easy to be a troll who is monetized and profit and built an empire on hate. It is easy to spew bigotry or stereotypes and find an audience in today's social media ecosystem. It is much harder to do the work of being a good person, of showing up in your communities, of showing up for your neighbors, of like trying to think about policies that could make a difference for everyone. And that's the thing that's kind of like a shame of this, is that if the only metric for the people who have the most influence and power in our political conversation just view this as a zero-sum game of like, did you generate conversation and a following? And does that make you good? Like, that's just a really bleak and cynical place to live, and it's not the place that I wanna live, it's not the place where I wanna raise my 5-year-old, and I think, so many people this week, like, just don't know what to do with that feeling.
I'm going to shift a little bit here. So Meredith wrote a piece in, let's say, February for now.
I also wrote a piece, like, 2 weeks ago.
I'm
I
going to
just don't
focus
ever
more
remind
in
people I write
February
more
for
than
now. We'll come
than
back to the one 2 weeks
February.
ago, but
Okay.
or probably won't in this conversation. But anyway, but it was called "Primary Every Democrat," and it really did emphasize the need to. She zoned in on Dick Durbin, the senator of Illinois, where Meredith lives, who has become kind of a quintessential example of the sort of stayed too long, was useful at some point person. So the argument was that we need to have more Democratic candidates be primary. And I think that actually is happening a little bit more than I expected, to be honest with you. And then Anna had a piece where she went to Maine and wrote about his name is Graham Planter, this exciting new sort of I'll call him progressive candidate there for now. So so I'm thinking about those pieces. I read a story in the New York Times today, which is Mondami apologizes for criticizing police in New York, and Mondami won a primary, a great thing. What has happened since then is that he has carefully taken steps to the right, I would say, and the New York Times, Hakeem Jeffries and Schumer have continued to be like, if only you will do these things, we might endorse you. And the New York Times continue to be critical of him. So I think my question is along the lines of, if we find good young candidates, if we find good candidates who are not like Dick Durbin, who are not like old person X, is the process going to allow them to actually get elected? Like, I don't know. I agree Mondami is better than Cuomo, but one of the challenges is winning the primary. But I'm what I'm wondering and winning the election. But I'm wondering if the process, if the kind of the forces in the Democratic Party are so strong that if you are someone who doesn't follow the rules, you have to follow the rules in order to. I mean, is the challenge bigger than just finding the right candidate? Is the structure really hard to beat here?
I think the Democratic Party has never been weaker, but putting that on the table, I'll let Anna speak.
I think if Janet Mills was running, I think Graham Planter would be in trouble. So we'll
Yeah,
come back in a year and discuss that. But I think she'll have all the money matters a lot. Anyway,
yeah.
yeah,
I it's the Democratic Party is weak in national policy sense,
in
right?
voter
And also
support, in
in
enthusiasm, it's weak. I agree with those
in
things.
all of those ways, it's weak
Yes,
in terms of like what as a party it can do to change anyone's lives.
yes, right,
It is strong in its ability to pick candidates and to hold the reins for internal, you
right.
know,
That's what I'm trying to say.
yeah. And I wonder if those things are always like if they can it's a equal sum game, so to speak, right? Like because the Republican Party is at hostage to a single person,
Mhm.
right? Which actually means I think the party infrastructure itself is actually not very strong because it's just
Yeah,
all
right. That's
what
the
does
point.
Trump want,
Yeah,
right? And that has given it a lot of power in general, I guess, because if you have just one person making decisions, like maybe it is easier to do stuff. And the Democrats are always going to be a little bit hamstrung by the fact that they're trying to like they one of our ethos, like or I wouldn't say our, I haven't called myself a Democrat in a while, but like the ethos of the Democratic Party kind of is like we really do need to kind of like, you know, do all of this different stuff. But what's happened in the Democratic Party is become a geriocracy, right? Like that is, I think, the real bias. And I think that to be young, it's weird to me. Like, I'm not sure if it's the youth that makes some of these candidates stand out or it's just they're not old,
okay.
you
Because
know?
Graham Planter's not that old. He's like
He's
42, I think, something like
40.
that. Yeah, he's 40.
Like,
Yeah, yeah,
I mean, I'm 50, so like that does seem young to me, but
yeah,
that's not like a firebrand. Like, I don't know. It's not
It's
AOC.
definitely
Like,
Senate young.
yeah.
That's
yeah,
like
it's definitely
Senate
Senate.
teenager.
Young. Oh, the one is like I spent like so much time with him. There's so much material that's not in that piece, including our conversation about skincare. Because he's a redhead like me, and I was like, "You're out here. You need to really
Interesting.
like, because you want it in the Senate." Although the joke was in the Senate, maybe you do want to ruin your skin. Um, so
Not in the future Senate.
so you can
All right.
fit in. So if he like comes up
Yeah.
really wrinkly, like they won't think that he's 40. Anyway, I think that the Mondami thing is particularly interesting. Also tied to Graham Plattner there. Some of the same people did their media.
Okay.
But what's weird about Mondami is he doesn't have to, he's gonna win. Like, why is he bothering like doing any kind of moderation, you know? Like he's going to like he's ahead by enough. Like it would be very unlikely for him to lose, right? I do want to look a little more closely at what he said.
Okay.
The other thing about Plattner is that I don't know. I mean, it's true it was to be a super uphill climb for him to do anything. If Bills gets in, I will point out if we're going to talk about age, she would be the oldest freshman senator of all time at 77.
Wow. Mills, for the
And
audience,
I
is the governor of Maine, and Schumer wants to recruit her because I think she's actually done some useful things, but she's very
she
much of the
has.
mold of
Yes.
the Democratic senator. She would not probably change very much, and she'd be very
Right.
comfortable for them.
Right.
So,
And I think people in Maine hate hate. There is a sentiment there that can be mined by someone who really does it right.
Yeah.
You know,
a
I
sort of
think
And that was like late in
anti-establishment.
growing.
Yeah,
I wrote multiple pieces for TNR about Susan Collins in the 2020 cycle, and
yeah.
I think all of that has really been growing over time. I wanted to speak about this age divide because I actually don't think like it's inherently like, oh, you're 25 and you look vigorous versus you are 75 and you don't. I also think it's about the trajectory of this country and how younger people have lived their lives and how they see our country and what they see as the ceiling versus what, boomers might have seen as the ceiling. Like I think about just what happened in my lifetime. Like I was a freshman in high school when 9/11 happened, then we went to war. I graduated college in the Great Recession. I had a baby in a global pandemic, and, now he's gonna go to kindergarten, and we're living in authoritarianism. And so the reality of my life, the reality of, like, what I experienced just, like, being in a neighborhood in Chicago and, like, knowing small business owners and, like, going to the farmer's market and just being a person who exists in this world. For some of these senators, like I mentioned Dick Durbin in the original piece, who have been in Washington since before I was born, like, the longest community Dick Durbin has ever been a part of is the United States Senate, and that is a very particular community that is not representative of our experience. And so I think one of the major challenges of the Democratic Party is, like, when you're only speaking when you are deciding who to be based on what you think is poll tested for what certain people are telling you or what they're saying on Morning Joe, like, you are just creating a composite that doesn't really match with what people want to hear. And I think that the cool thing about the Mamdani race, like, I don't want to go down a rabbit hole of talking about ranked choice voting, which I thought was, like, incredible and, like, had an outcome that was so amazing in the Democratic primary because you ended up having people positively campaigning, rallying around ideas, building coalitions, and keeping a sex pest from winning. Like, that was a good outcome for democracy, right? So, I could talk about that forever. But what one of the things that I think that has been so important about his candidacy is that he doesn't pretend like he hates New York and that it needs to be fixed because it's so broken and it's so bad. He's run a campaign that, like, I love the city. Like, I grew up in the city. I live in the city. Like, the people who live in the city should be able to live in the city forever. And I think that that's what people want to feel about America. And I don't think that he's taken some of these critiques of the New York Times seriously because it hasn't changed the perspective of voters. Like, they had this incredible piece of social media content where they were just mocking the piece in the New York Times where the Hamptons was upside
Right.
down
Yes.
over the fact he
Yes.
might be the next mayor. Like, there's so much misalignment in terms of where our corporate media is and where the Democratic Party is and where people are in their everyday lives right now that, when we think about the power centers of the Democratic Party, right, there is an organized fundraising operation, right? Like, we live in a time post Citizens United where, there's infinite money from infinite people for everything, right? So I don't want to discount how expensive it is to run some of these Senate races or to run in competitive House districts. But what I do want to question is, like, to what end is spending all that money? What is that impact if you're going to end up putting forward candidates who are not actually resonating with people at a time where we just, like, can't mess around anymore? Like, I think the average person who pays this much attention knows that at this juncture, where all of these federal agencies have been gutted, where we don't have an international humanitarian aid presence, where we don't really have a CDC, where certain states now have governors that are trying to get headlines over saying they're not going to have vaccine mandates anymore, when we don't have a corporation for public broadcasting that supports putting stations in rural America, having them get, like, signals beamed in the sky or high quality early childhood education programming. All of these things have fallen away. And it's not just like you get to elect any Democrat and just flip a switch and it's all back on. Like, we're not playing in the margins anymore. And I think people who are seeing everything that's happening are really sort of wondering what happens next and looking for anyone who's able to say anything that, like, recognizes sort of the severity of that situation. And that's currently not congressional leadership in
Let
Washington.
me say it.
It
Yeah.
so
Let me say it differently then. I guess I
yeah.
agree with most of the things you all have said. What I may say is I am distressed by a situation in which Mondami wins, and the result is Kristen Gillibrand, the person in charge, person in charge of recruiting candidates, a powerful person, goes on a unhinged rant about him, suggesting he aligns with terrorists functionally. Last week, she made a milder version of the same comments. So the urgency that Meredith feels, the problems she describes, are shared by all the the Democrats I know, except for the ones who serve in Congress, who think the biggest thing possible, the biggest problem is New York might have a mayor who has said some. So I guess the dissonance between where the voters, the base, where regular people, where my mom is, the urgency we feel and the lack of urgency they feel, I struggle with each day, and I feel like we're all writing columns and doing things. We're not. I worry we're not moving them, and I worry. Come back to the beginning. Ezra Klein, the one person who maybe I worry we have to spend a lot of time influencing 97 white columnists to influence these members of Congress. I'm not sure what the dissonance is.
I want to bring this back to something that, again, what informs, like, I think the journalism we're passionate about is the storytelling about people who are real and having real life experiences. Because, like, one of the things I think that really is attractive about Graham Plattner, for one thing, is that he's, like, been in the world, and his politics is informed by his experience as a veteran of 2 terrible wars. Like, he's very anti-war. As, like, I mean, my whole piece, like, has to do with, like, oyster as praxis. Like, it's so interesting to me, like, that what he does for a living, oyster farming, is actually this nexus of, like, imperialism and colonialism in terms of, like, how it was extractive capitalism of all the overfishing that was done, but then it was, like, brought back by public funding, and now it's like this small business that's stayed afloat because of environmental regulations. And he has a story to tell about that, right? And, like, when you think about the stories that that Dick Durbin can tell or Chuck Schumer can tell, they're not about their own lives. They're not about their own lived experiences, because most of their lived experience has been in the halls of Congress, right? Like, I fully believe we are not meant as a country to have professional, like, politicians.
Just what Jefferson and Adams thought.
Right.
Right. Yeah.
Right. Like, I mean, I want people with experience.
Forever.
Like, I want people with experience. Like, I don't believe, like, necessarily turnover for turnover's sake. But, like, clearly, like, when the people you hang out with, like, you are people in Congress, and everyone watches fucking Morning Joe. Like, this is what you get. You get people arguing about fine tuning, like, little tiny centrist things, and you don't get discussion about the fucking, like, or you get them just as bad. You get, oh no, we live in a fascist state, it's authoritarianism, as like and then kind of like, isn't that terrible? But now let's talk about this very small bore, ACA fix.
Yes, right, exactly.
Right. And you get you get like, oh, but comity. Oh, but, like, we have to play fair. And the other, this is one of the great things, again, big Graham Plattner fan. He's like, I'm not going to DC to try and convince people. I'm going there to, like, knock heads and, like, get stuff done with the power of, like, the movement that we're going to build. I love that line, which is basically a stump speech now, which is, he's like, I'm not going to DC to convince people. That's the anti-Ezra Klein comment, right? Okay. Like, fuck persuasion. Like, I don't think he means literally knock heads. I'm going to be very careful. Like, he doesn't actually use that term, but he does say he's anti-persuasion. He wants to use brute force power, which is how we have to do things.
Okay.
Well, and I think that sort of goes to, like, your first question, Perry. Like, well, like, the three of us are probably not going to convince, any number of the, like, army of white dude takers. But you know what I think about some of this, like, frantic coverage in the New York Times, or Kirsten Gillibrand going on Brian Lear and, like, losing her mind?
I mean, that was insane. People watching
that. We don't need to convince them, because they saw the results of that campaign, and they knew that it won. And there's an entire ecosystem built on running campaigns that look fundamentally different than that, about talking about things that are fundamentally different. And they saw that someone did it, and they did it at scale, and it worked. And that's what has them fearful. I think that's where a lot of this, like, pushback is coming from, because, like, obviously New York City is a very particular place. And I hear a lot of people say, well, what works in New York City isn't going to work in Nebraska. Okay, cool. New York City, Nebraska, different places. However, an approach that works, talking about, like, issues that people care about, being out and meeting with people, all of those are the fundamentals of politics, and they're seeing how it's done, and it was being done better than, like, some of the ways that they've been trying to do it, some of the, like, advice that people get to be too guarded or don't overpromise. I think about the freak out that people have had about free buses like
Yes.
talking about like lived
Insane.
experience. So
Or
in
these
Chicago,
foods or these like food
These grocery
desert
stores
things.
in America,
so
apparently we have 2 free
can I
grocery stores,
can
you
I
know.
tell you? So in Chicago, you can ride the CTA buses for free until you are 7, as long as you're with a fair-paying adult. So at the beginning of the summer at my son's daycare, I signed a CTA bus waiver, and my son took the CTA bus everywhere. He knows every route line. He took it to the zoo, and he took it to a bunch of different parks, and he took it to Wrigley Field, and like the entire city opened for him, 4-year-old at the time. And it was amazing, and it was so easy, and it changed the way he was able to live his little life. And, like, you know, we take away a few police settlements, and we can pay for free buses. Like, one of the old adages in politics, like, every budget is a statement of priorities, and it's a statement of values. We could spend differently at the municipal level, at the state level, at the federal level. I mean, we're starting to really see like big contrasts, I think, as the federal government has disintegrated between what states are doing what and what they think they need to be spending money on now. But some of these things, like we have examples for them. Sorry, I lost my headphone. I don't know. It's still too early and it's Friday and we survived the week. And so like these things are only radical if you don't believe that the average person should have access to just like a better quality of life. Like we can realign, we can make cities work better. And by the way, that shouldn't be controversial because so many Americans, the majority of Americans live in cities of some kind. So, I don't know exactly what is going to happen, but I do know that the energy of primary every Democrat and the thing that continues to get posted over and over again, even though the piece ran in February, is that somewhere in the immediate response to Ronald Reagan, Democrats decided that it was politically expedient to run away from the idea of government. They were, and never at one point did they say, actually, government is good. And so now when we're seeing all of these functions of government sort of taken away, and we're not having this spectrum debate of like, okay, well, maybe bigger government or little government. Like now that this binary has become more stark, I think that there's just a lot of pressure on the people who are supposed to be on the side of government to really recognize the stakes of the fight and to put ideas behind how we're going to get from like point A to point B.
And with that, I want to sort of wrap up here. If you all have any final thoughts or things you want to plug, I always want people to plug of like book you've read, article you think was worth reading. Because I'm trying to model this myself on Blue Sky yesterday not to praise myself, but I did note instead of hate sharing Ezra's piece, let's love share Anna's piece, which addresses
It was
the
so
same
good.
issues
I
in
really
a
did.
good way. That's it. So if anything you want to plug, shout out, or anything you've done. You all mentioned a few of your pieces. Anything you've read, any publication, any author, what have you. So let's close it there.
I'll go. This hasn't come up in a direct way, but I want to plug it, which is I have a podcast called Past Due, which is about surviving the creative economy. And it's not obviously a politics show, but it is because I do firmly believe that the creative economy is like the front line for the entire economy. That creative workers, people were the first gig workers, the first to feel the squeeze of like labor practices, the first to like have to. We're probably going to do a show about the ACA changes because like the people that listen to our show are going to be like the people that fall off the ACA cliff, and I won't go into like what that is, but that's going to be really important for them. And we like recently did an episode with a sex worker, Siri Dahl, because our thoughts about that, and she came on to talk about it further, is that sex work is actually the leading edge, Like what happens for sex workers, in some ways both good and bad, is what's going to happen to everyone else. Like they were really freed by being able to own their own content, right? Like they were really freed by being like this, like OnlyFans was an amazing step forward for sex workers. And now because of censorship, because of corporate consolidation, for all these things, like they're seeing and also because of the recession, I had no idea people are cutting back on paid porn consumption. Like, subscriptions are falling. So I think that if you're interested in the kinds of things we're talking about, like, and if you care about art, we have, in addition to sex worker, musicians, writers, screenwriters, other video essayists, And I think that it's an important conversation. So
Say the
past
name
due
of the podcast
podcast.
one more time.
Past due.
Yes,
Haha. It's like
I get
bills
it.
and getting credit for stuff. So past due, I actually hosted or co-hosted with Open Mike Eagle, who's a rapper and comedian and writer in LA. And I think between the two of us, we bring like a really interesting kind of like set of perspectives, and definitely like our networks are different. So like people who listen to me and watch me might find some of the guests familiar, but there's also a whole other set of guests that we have on that are from his world, and I think that it's a really interesting mix of folks. So self-promotion, but I think it's
Amazing.
That's great.
So I will also self-promote. I had alluded to this at the beginning of the podcast, but my most recent essay at the New Republic is exploring the dire situation for residents of DC and the unique functions of like how the residents of DC are able to live because of this like conservatorship relationship between the federal government and the municipal government. And I worry that they're more than a month into occupation and people don't feel like that's as sexy of a headline. But ultimately, if we don't have a capital city where good, smart people can live and work freely without fear of like one of their kids' classmates' parents being taken by the federal government, that we're never going to be able to rebuild this project. So if we want a democracy, we need full citizenship rights for residents of DC. And if Democrats actually are able to win back the country, making DC a state, giving them 2 senators and a member of the House who can actually vote should be a top priority.
And a member of the House, they could try for one who can actually walk around. Okay, that was too
Well,
hard.
I mean, walking around, but also voting.
Yes,
Also voting.
also voting. Yes, yes.
That's the
And
structural problem. We want to talk about big structural problems here, Perry.
and on that note, thank you all for joining me. This was a great conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good to
Thank
see you. Thanks
you.
for watching, people. Everyone. And I'll close out there.